and welcome to another episode of the Building Your Brand podcast. And I guess today is going to be another one that's a bit personal. These solo episodes are a bit more me talking about what's going on in my business and how I'm feeling about stuff. And I guess I wanted to talk about identity when it comes to your work. And one of the things that got me thinking about this was the labels that we give ourselves. So I had a really interesting conversation on the podcast with Rich Webster, and this was a few months ago now, and I'll obviously link the episode in the show notes. But basically, the crux of the conversation was, well, we talked about all sorts of things, but one of the things that I can't stop thinking about was he talked about how he had sort of two different areas of his business. So his design agency, and then he was like creating content and doing sort of mentoring for other businesses. And he basically decided to shut down his design agency and go all in on his, content and mentoring business. And I asked him if he struggled to do that as a designer, to sort of close that aspect of his business. Because what I realized was that for me, the title graphic designer has become like a really big part of my identity, to the point that I would find it really difficult to give up. And he said that he hadn't struggled with that. And one of the reasons that he thought that was because he hadn't gone to study graphic design. So he was self-taught. He hadn't been sort of trained in that sphere. And so for him, it was much easier to let go of. And he said that he had worked with lots of different clients who had been trained in design, who had studied it, who had invested a lot of time and energy into learning it. Not that he hadn't invested time and energy, but obviously it wasn't in a sort of formal setting. But that because of them going to university for it, that they really struggled with letting go of that identity. And it really got me thinking, because I have pinned so much of my identity, I think, over the years on my role, my career. I mean, I know that is something, as a capitalist society, that people really value. It's one of the first questions that we ask each other, what do you do? One of the things, that I really struggled with when I was on maternity leave was, well, how do I answer that question? And I guess, I still said, oh, I'm a graphic designer, even though I was like not actually doing much design during those times. But is an interesting one. And then the other thing that really got me thinking about it was, I guess, having a think about my business makeup now, and how much of the money do I make comes from design work, how much comes from like content creation, sponsorship, public speaking, like other strands of my business, this podcast even. I have all these different sort of income streams, and I haven't checked recently, but I'm fairly certain that at points it has possibly tipped over where I'm earning more money from non-design activities than design activities. And so then that raises the question, can I still call myself a designer if that is not the thing that I'm spending the most time doing? Now, deep down, I know that I can. And that is how I market myself. That is my job. That is what I want to spend a decent chunk of my time doing. But it did sort of raise a lot of questions in me, and it did, I guess, really challenge me on how much of my identity I have placed in my role, my job, how people perceive me, what they think I do with my days day to day. But I think this is becoming more and more common in today's age. Gone are the days like my dad, for example, who got a job and then basically stayed in that job his entire career. I mean, admittedly, it changed over time and he got promoted and things, but he stayed in the same place for pretty much his whole career. That is so rare now. And, people have lots of different jobs, but also if people work for themselves, they often do lots of different things. And I know there's other designers out there where, potentially they've grown a massive social media following, ended up making a lot more money from like brand deals than maybe from design clients, and have had a sort of similar, I guess, like bit of an existential crisis about who they are and what they do. And I don't really have any answers to share with you today, but more, I guess I just wanted to start the conversation. And I think ultimately where I've landed is I get to decide, what I call myself, who I am, and what is important to me. But I think it is more common for us to be sort of confused about that. And I don't think that's a bad thing, to be honest, because I think it's good for us to sort of break away from this bygone era where it was like train to be something, you do that thing for the rest of your life, and that is what you're known for. And obviously there's still going to be people that is the case for. I mean, I am pretty much an example of that. But there's also going to be people who, they pivot and they take their skills and they do lots of different things. And I think that needs to become more normalized and be less sort of frowned upon or shamed, because that is actually becoming far more common. And I think for me personally, that is something that I really want to challenge myself on, that I don't get too obsessed with the title and with just calling myself a graphic designer. And that I acknowledge the other things that I do, the other strings to my bow. I guess in my Instagram bio, let me have a look and see what it says. Let's see what I wrote last time I updated it. So it says graphic designer, public speaker, and Adobe ambassador. So I guess at this point in my career, I've decided that sort of those are the three most important things to mention. It does also mention my podcast. I haven't put podcast host in my sort of description, but I've put listen to the Building Your Brand podcast. So that is in my bio as well. Yeah, like it's interesting. Part of my identity is also that I'm a podcast host, public speaker. I've obviously thought that the fact that I work with Adobe and I'm an ambassador for them was worthwhile to include in my Instagram bio. I would love to hear what you've decided to include in your Instagram bio. Like, what have you thought is most important in defining yourselves and what you do? I have really noticed, and I am the same here, and I am doing all sorts of unlearning, but I have really noticed like how obsessed we are with like labels and putting people in boxes. Like we like to neatly package everybody in a box so that we can like understand them. We sort of create some context for them, like we know what to expect. And I think that gives us a real sense of safety. And then when people maybe do something that means they don't sit neatly in a box that we've given them, it throws us a bit and it confuses us. I think one of the other areas where I see this happen a lot and I feel frustration about it is how we love to label ourselves introvert or extrovert. Now, I would definitely describe myself as an extrovert, but actually over the years, I have noticed far more introverted tendencies in me. I need a mix. I need a mix of like different ways of getting energy. And I think sometimes I feel so frustrated that I have to define myself in these particular ways with these particular labels when I don't necessarily feel like I identify with them all of the time. Some days I feel extroverted, some days I feel introverted. Some days I spend all my days doing graphic design, some days I do no design and I feel more like a podcast host or a content creator. So I guess all of this to say, is that you get to tell the story of who you are. And I think this is a big part of what personal branding is all about. I remember chatting to Christine Gritmon on the podcast, and she talked about how personal branding isn't about sharing everything about yourself, but it's about choosing certain aspects and almost like strategically amplifying those aspects. So you get to decide the narrative, you get to decide the story, you get to decide how you want to present yourself in the world. But I do think, it takes some work to work out what that is, to work out what feels authentic, what feels right, what doesn't feel limiting, because I think sometimes it can feel so limiting if we have to say we're one thing when we feel like we're lots of different things. So I would love to know your thoughts. This is a very sort of like short, rambly, just musings on a topic. But I would love it to start a conversation because it's something that I think about quite a lot, something that I chat to friends about, something that I struggle with sometimes. So I would love to hear if you've thought about how you sort of present yourself, how you identify yourself, the title that you've given yourself. I think another aspect of it is that sometimes we can just decide that we are this thing. So, I've heard of loads of people who are like, well, I really want to be a photographer. And sometimes they just have to give themselves that label, write it on their Instagram bio, like give themselves that label and come to terms with it and accept it and not feel that imposter syndrome anymore, because they're doing photography. So they are a photographer. I've seen that with writers as well, people who don't want to or feel all sorts of feels about calling themselves a writer, but like, who gets to define whether someone's a writer or not? If you're writing, you could be a writer. So yeah, it's interesting, the sort of processes and the thoughts we have to go through to create these labels for ourselves and to share them with the world. So yeah, come and let me know what you think. Come and let me know how you feel about labels and maybe putting yourselves in particular boxes and whether that's helped you or not. You can find me at Liz M. Mosley or at Building Your Brand Podcast on Instagram, or if you're watching this on YouTube, then you can just comment below. But yeah, I'd love to know. I'd love to know what you think, and hopefully I'm not the only one who's sitting here pondering these things, and other people will identify with some of the struggles that I've described.